Okay, I'm making this video a day later than I said I would because I wanted to be in a fresher state of mind and a more analytical state of mind than just after I completed the raids. So this is going to be that. I'm just making this a day later for those reasons. So this is going to be me talking about all 3 raids all at once, or like all back to back. Just a bit more of an analytical sort of review kind of thing, my opinions on it, what I like, what I don't like. And there will be spoilers, so if you haven't played it yet or you don't want spoilers or something, now would be a good time to click off the video. But if you don't care about that type of thing, or if you've already played the raids, you can stay right here and continue watching. Alright, so let's start with the first raid. The first raid has anywhere between 5 and 7 individual areas, depending on how you split it. The first area is this area that we're going to be calling the eggs or egg sacs area with little red eggs everywhere. But first, let's talk about the opening. The opening to the first raid is beautiful. It is absolutely stunning. Amazing artwork and detail put into it by Sucker Punch. They really outdid themselves with this. It's a great first impression that the raid makes. It's even more fantastical than the story missions that you run through in this DLC. It's really cool looking. Alright, first things up is the eggs area. What there is there's a bunch of eggs. You have to break them by having enemies die and explode near them. And then in some of these eggs there will be these crystals that you have to take to a door and put them in their sockets, and they will open the door. It's not too difficult. The first raid isn't too difficult. It's just teaching you new mechanics. So you'll find that to be a common thing about when I'm talking about raid number 1 is it's not too difficult. But you are facing a lot of very tough enemies. You're facing a lot of Oni, a lot of boss Oni. So it's not like it's a walk in the park either. It's just not as difficult as you might expect from a raid that's supposed to be on nightmare difficulty. Okay, then we go to part 2, which is I'm going to put part 2 and what most people put as part 2 and part 3 all together in part 2. Part 2, there's a transition between part 1 and part 2. This most people call part 2. It's just a jumping sort of puzzle area. There's a bit of parkour and swinging grapples and a bit of a puzzle with not too much of a puzzle, but it's you help people, you help your teammates around by stepping on a button. Then they all jump across. Then they step on a button, and then you jump across. And then at the very end of this area, there's the introduction to a very fun mechanic known as the. There's not really a name for it. There's like red orbs or eyes. I'm gonna call them red eyes throughout the rest of this. That are floating throughout the area as you jump down the last bit of the this transition area. And these are things that if you get caught in them, they will. If you get caught in them and don't stop moving, which means you can continually dodge while you're in this thing and you won't be stuck or continue to attack. But if you stop moving, you will be encased in like wood or roots. And you have to get hit by either enemies or allies to be freed. And if you're not hit, you immediately go down after a while. Also to say, if you don't, being able to move around is definitely a bug. You can exploit that right now if you want to. It doesn't stop though if you continue to move around. If you don't get hit, you will eventually go down anyways. It doesn't stop that. It still technically thinks that you are restrained. So just a heads up for that. Anyways, the second actual area is this place. It's just like a village, and there are a bunch of enemies you first have to clear out, and then you have to go to the end of the village, and there's this big door and a little sort of blood well looking thing beneath it. And then once you all stand in it, it starts up this next session, this next phase of this area, and it's the disciples of Io start spawning, and you have to go kill them, and you get these essentially points. And when you have these points, you can kill other enemies to gain more points to a max of 20. And if you lose points, you have to go get more. If you lose all the points, you can't gain points by killing enemies. You have to go kill another disciple of Io. What you have to do is have as many points as possible and then go drain it in the blood well to fill up the door. And you have to do this all under a time limit, which is something that is constantly throughout most of the raids. If Io's searching for you, it's just basically the way of getting this done in a certain amount of time. Because if he finds you, it's an instant game over. It's a simple but cool way of doing it. And once you get enough souls, soul potency is what it's called, you fill up the door and it opens, and that's the end of that area. I think this area is really cool. It puts a new, not super annoying spin on the Disciples of Io, and they also go down in one hit, which is awesome. And it's a really, really awesome mechanic that I think works really well. You also should have someone standing in it, preferably someone like a hunter, standing in the blood well at all times to make sure it doesn't go down. Up next is area number 3, kind of technically. It's just a parkour puzzle area. Not very many enemies. And what you do through this is, you then go through and just jump, step on more buttons. There's some of those red eyes floating around. And yeah, it's just a parkour puzzle where you have to find the right way to go. It's not too challenging as long as you don't get knocked out by one of the eyes in an area you can't get out of, or an area your teammates can't get to. But other than that, it's not too difficult. It's pretty good, pretty well made. After this, you go to a new area where there's attunement enemies. Or not attunement enemies, but there's attunements, and there's basically like the rituals that you had to stop in the story mode. It's like that in a way. So for the attunements, you use them, and you can use them for another recurring mechanic throughout the rest of the raid. Is things I'm calling attunement jumps, or like the platforms that spawn because if you have a certain attunement. But if you have an attunement, you cannot see which attunement is to which spawnable platform. So you have to have 3 people with attunements and 1 person without attunements, telling each person who to jump where. And then once you get all the attunements, you can knock it down. You can knock it all down, and then you go on to the next area. And then this area is a bridge to the final area with just a bunch of the sort of spirit Ronin enemies. You can just run past them. There's also the red eyes, so run past them, be careful of the eyes, and you should be fine. It's not too difficult. You don't have to fight them. You get to this final area, and this is my favorite mechanic in the raid. Is this big, I think the reused asset of the Buddha temple. And there's 4 statues around that have these things called Ascension Trials. And what you do is you accept the Ascension Trial, and then you have to kill a bunch of enemies while have at half health, like you have the Gyozan Curse, as well as having one of your core gameplay features taken away from you. The 4 that they are is, 1 is no ranged attacks, 1 is no dodging, 1 is no class ability, and 1 is no melee attacks. So for the it's pretty simple how it works, but it's also really interesting because, you know, if you're a hunter, you don't want to get the no ranged attacks, and if you're a samurai, you don't want to get the no melee attacks. So it's an interesting strategy that you have to pull through, but it's a very, very fun mechanic that doesn't actually come back, and I was kind of sad. This is the only time it's used because I actually really enjoyed it. But that's the first raid. My first run through it took me about 2 hours. We had 2 Ronins, an assassin, and a samurai for this raid, and it was really fun. I had decent expectations, and they were far beyond exceeded. This was an amazing experience. I loved this first raid. Now moving on to the second raid, it starts off with a small fight and then attunement jumps. A lot of attunement jumps. It's not too bad in the beginning. Just go through the attunement jumps, and sometimes you have to go at the same time, and then you get to checkpoints. And then there's this one area where you fight some enemies, and then you have to have the one person without attunements go. You have everyone with attunements step on some buttons, and the one person without attunement goes across, and then helps the other, and then fights an Oni and an Oni archer, and then goes through a big maze of red eyes, and then has to stand on a button. And while on this button, the platforms for attunement jumps show up. Thing is, there's 5 of them, and there's also 5 red orbs that go right across each platform. This took my party a very, very long time to pass. It's very difficult, especially when you're a Ronin who has bombs and cannot save your teammates. I feel like that was a slight oversight. Yeah, you should probably have the hunter or someone with a bow at least go and be this person. I would say preferably hunter for a reason I'll get to in a second. After you get through it, which depending on what you have set up and if you guys have a good strategy, should take you not too long, or it will take you a very long time. They will jump to the next area, and then immediately combat will start, and you won't be there if you're the person sitting on the button. So combat starts, and then they have to fight enemies, and this is the reason you want a hunter, so you can fight from afar, because you still can't really help them if you have bombs. So fight from afar, even ult if you need to, and then once that fight's done, they'll all step on 3 buttons. You can jump down to them, and then you have to leave them again. And then they have to go through another big area, fighting enemies, doing attunement jumps as you step on buttons to help them get to where they need to go. And then that's the end of Area 1. It's a very interesting area. I think it goes on a little too long. Personally, I think they also had a few oversights with how some of the parts of the intended solutions. I think there was a few oversights for somehow some people won't actually be able to do that. So that's something, but it's not that bad. The next, it's not the best, but it's also not the worst. The next area is a blood ritual that you have to disrupt. First thing first, kill all the enemies. Same thing as the Village of Disciples back in the first part. But now there's a big blood well in the middle with a massive sort of plate, and then 2 smaller blood wells up on like small hills with smaller plates. And what you have to do for this one is fill up the runes around the big center plate for the door to open. And how you do this is having at least 1 person on each plate. Sounds simple, but if you're in the middle plate, you start gaining stacks of something called corruption. And if you gain up to 10 corruption, you die immediately, and you have to restart from that checkpoint. But the ones on the outside, the wells on the outside, take corruption away from you. So the best way to do it is to stagger, having 2 people on the right side, 2 people on the left side, and just stagger. The person goes to the right. The person that goes to the right, for example, gets 3 corruption before the other person even enters the thing and starts stacking corruption, so that when they get to like 8 or 9, they can leave, and then the other person can jump down and start gaining corruption. Then you can leave, and the other person can jump down, and that way you at least have 1 person on every single area. But also, if you go down, you no longer count as being on an area. So just a heads up for that. It's kind of difficult because the timing is very slim, because again, EO is hunting you and you're under a time limit here. And the timing is very, very tight for this. You have maybe 15 seconds of leeway, which is not a lot when it comes to coordinating 4 people, possibly across the world, who don't exactly have a strategy when going into this, because it's not explained too well to you. It's kind of just figure it out for yourself, which is one of its positives, is that nothing is directly explained to you. It's kind of just figured out for yourself, trial and error. But it's a lot of enemies. It's a lot of tough enemies, especially in the middle. So it's a difficult, very, very difficult. It can be even frustrating. But it's still quite fun. And then you move on to the third area. And this third area is where you get the spirit bow, the bow of Uchitsune. And what you'd use this for is you just pop open some of those circles, like the one that you shot on the cursed tree in that one story mission. And when you break it, platforms spawn, and it's just like the attunement platforms, but attunement. And then you just jump across these, and there's 3 things you have to break, or 3 things you have to shoot with it. And it goes like, first one, and then you fight enemies, and then you shoot the second one, go across, you fight some enemies, and the third one, you go across, you fight some enemies. And then this third one, there's the last one without a thing you have to shoot, but there's a way to go around, and you can see the ones in the back. So you have 2 people go up around to be able to see the first 2, and then 1 person has to stay back before crossing the 3rd one to shoot that one, and you have to shoot all 3 at the same time, because you barely have enough time to break it by yourself by shooting on cooldown. And once you break all 3, you all have to rush through the last one to get to the end. And if, say, for example, 2 or 3 people get to the end and 1 person does not, everyone else cannot go back and they cannot go forward, so you have to reset. Be very careful when doing this and try not to be slow. You have some time, but it's still under a time limit, and if 1 person's slow or just messes up a jump, you all have to run back, or you're gonna have to reset. Then after that, it's just some enemies, some like spirit Oni archers, or like the ghost Oni archers, and then you have to shoot 2 more at the same time, and then it opens up another pathway, and it's done and done, and you'd be in that area. It's pretty simple and self-explanatory for the most part. It shouldn't take you too long, especially if you know what to do. But this is definitely the easiest part of this mission. Going into part 4 is an area with attunement and with enemies with attunement, and what you have to do is you have to fight these attunement enemies without the attunement, with only the bow, and go find attunements around so you can break these rituals. And even as you go further through, there will be more attunements added, and you have to use the attunements to jump across and get to higher areas. There has to be coordination, and you have to use coordination to get attunements that are out of reach normally, and it's a lot. It can be quite annoying to figure out, but because you're also always doing this with endless waves of enemies, not even easy enemies like attuned Oni coming at you, so it's not too easy, but it's not too difficult. Not too difficult as the first 2 areas for sure, but it can be quite annoying. If you can't tell, I am not the biggest fan of most of, so far, the second raid as I am the first one. The first one I feel like was more fun, not because it was easier, just because it had some better mechanics that weren't overused. But anyways, once you get through 3 of these, you go into the 4th area, part 2. This 4th area is just another one of those egg areas. Those red egg areas, except for there's only 2. There's a lot of red eggs, but there's only 2 that you need to open, and they are far up this like staircase on the left and far up the staircase on the right. And once you open them up, you grab the crystals, and then you have to drop down and run past all these attuned enemies and Oni up this fucking staircase. And there's a lot of red orbs and attunement enemies, and oh my god, it is not easy to get up that staircase. But once you get them all in, all the enemies die, and that's the end of area 4. It can be a bit of a pain, but it's not the worst. Now going on to area 5 is some spirit bow jumps, spirit bow parkour, along with the attunement parkour mixed together to get to the actual final area. And in this final area, there's a pillar in the middle, 2 little like flesh plates with hearts beating above them. I never want to say that combination of words again. And once you're there for a little bit, kind of exploring this thing called the Purification Crystal, which is the crystals that you had been putting in the slots this entire time. That's what it's called. And it spawns in the middle, and you pick it up, put it in one of the 4 slots around the pillar, and then that's when it starts. And immediately, or not quite immediately, but pretty quickly, off to the left, another one of them spawns, and an attunement spirit bow thing you have to shoot pops up, and then I think the person with the moon attunement has to go along with someone else to that area with over some parkour, and then you go through, fight a bunch of enemies, break some of those like flesh gates with the blood portal thing, but there's a lot of them that you have to pass through, and you have to break them, and then grab the crystal, and then run through like a maze with a bunch of those spirit Ronin enemies, and it's quite difficult unless you have an assassin who can just stealth and smoke bomb your way through. But once you get through, you drop down and then put the crystal in, and you put the crystal in, and then that part's done, and all the enemies die. Now let's talk about the little plates. Enemies are going to be spawning in waves and rushing towards those plates, and they're just going to sit there, and then the heart beating above them is going to be sucking out the life of the enemies. And if the heart gets the final hit on enemies, 1 stack of corruption is added to the pillar. And if the pillar gets full on stacks of corruption, that's a game over, and you have to start over from the checkpoint. But if you get the Purification Crystal, stacks reset, and all enemies die. So it's like a breathing. It's a point to breathe. So that's the second Purification Crystal. The third one is off to the right. I think Storm Attunement and someone else should go that way. It's the same thing. You shoot the spirit bow and then do some jumps. There's a lot more parkour on this one, and there's a few enemies that you can kind of just run past. And then once you get to the crystal, you pick it up, break through 1, 2, 3, 4 those like blood portal things. And how I did it was we had an assassin and me go through this one. The assassin picked it up. I broke through the first one, and then we ran to the second one. I broke through that one, and then after I broke through it, he group stealthed us. Then we ran to the next one. I broke through it, and that's when about stealth ran out. And then it is basically right there is the fourth one, so he just ran over to it and smoke bombed. I broke through that one, and we just ran down. This one takes about 2 minutes if you do it fast and right, and you don't even have to hit any enemies. And then you get the third one done. And then the final one is actually, there's 2 different ones that you have to go to at the top of these stairs. 2 people have to go, or 1 person has to go to each one, and it's just a lot of parkour and jumping you have to go through. And you have to be pretty fast because it is under a fairly tight time limit. But once you get up there, there's no enemies. You just stand on a button. Both people stand on a button, and then 2 platforms in the center of the arena pop up. And then a third person has to go up those 2 platforms and grab a crystal. And once they grab the crystal, you can just leave. And then they have to run back down the stairs and place the final crystal before it ends. And I actually really, really enjoyed this this final area. It was a lot of fun. It's a really cool way of doing it. A way of having a kind of boss fight end of the raid. And it encourages a lot of teamwork as well. It's a really awesome, really awesome. It redeems the earlier parts of the raid because it was really fun. But this raid, because of the first 2 areas for the most part, took about 4 hours and 15 minutes to complete. Which is why I had to do the third one the next day. And the third one is just a boss fight with Io herself. It starts off, you just run up this long pathway. Pretty long pathway, to kind of eerily long, to the boss arena. And then there's those 2 plates with the hearts above them again, and the pillar. And then there's also 2 torii gates floating in the sky in the top left and right corners. And what you have to do is you have to go through these torii gates, have 1 person stand on a button to open up platforms, and then have 1 other person jump on these platforms and then go through the torii gate. And then once you go through the torii gate, you get into a duel with Io, an actual duel like from the base game. It's something I actually wanted to have be added, more duels to Ghost of Tsushima, and I'm so glad it's added. This is easily the hardest duel in the entire game, even from the base story. But you only have to do 1/4 of it. So in these duels, you gain corruption stacks, and there's an achievement where you have to gain no more than or less than 5. Everyone has to gain less than 5 to get the class item cosmetic. And you only get 4 chances to even fight Io. So if the last person has to kill her. But for people that are outside of the Io fight, the Io duel, there's a big fucking Io that is just sitting there, and she will occasionally attempt to, I guess, throw up on the pillar, and these attunement the spirit bow circles will pop up, and you have to shoot them with the bow, and 1 or 2 will pop up if no one's in the duel, but 4 will pop up around the sides around her head, and you have to break the correct one, which is something that the person in the duel has to call out. A icon will appear around her, and you have to call out, top or bottom or left or right, and have the people shoot those. Have your teammates shoot that one outside, and it'll do about the amount that a perfect parry counter will do to her guard in damage. Also, if you fail this, she will throw up and add corruption to the pillar. You can also get ejected from the fight early. If your teammates want to, they can shoot a thing above you with their spirit bow, and it'll eject you early. Anytime a ghost gets ejected from the fight, the pillar gets immediately reset, even if it's not ejected by EO. But then again, you only get 4. So if the one person only does, for example, 1/8 of the health before they have to get ejected, the next person, one of the other people, has to end up doing more. Everyone else either has to pick up their slack, or one person has to pick up their slack. But it's a really, really awesome fight with a lot of complexity and a lot of strategy involved. And after you end up killing EO in that duel, all 4 of you, she spawns as a normal enemy. But this time you can use things like your ultimates and your class abilities and your ranged weapons and your ghost tools, and you all 4 can fight her at once, so you can kind of just beat her to death in a corner. It's more cathartic than anything. I think it wasn't supposed to be too difficult. You can kind of just throw down smoke bombs and caltrops and go to town. And then that's the end of the 3rd phase. That's the end of the 3rd part of the raid. It is really fun. A really good fight. Really well done. Such awesome visuals. It is something that I would say you should do. It is a fight you should do before soon. If you haven't done it yet, you should do it. It is a very, very good raid to be a part of. Something else, a bit of a tip, is be at the recommended gear level, or you will do 10% less damage and take 10% more. Be at the recommended gear level of 110. It's just a good idea. But yeah, that's kind of the summarization of all of everything. So, all in all, this was... wow. This is free. This entire DLC is free. Sucker Punch outdid themselves with this. It is an amazing, amazing raid. It is hard. It is only possible with 4 people. The last one's not necessarily. I bet you could do the final raid. The boss battle with 3 people if you're very coordinated. But everything else is required for. So that's something else. And it's also probably a good idea that they didn't allow for matchmaking, because randoms are not going to coordinate very well, and they might not have microphones. So it's still really fun, and it's a good idea to play it if you haven't. If none of your friends play it, join a Discord, get some people. People are constantly looking for groups to play this with. It is ridiculously fun. It just should be Game of the Year, and if it's not, I'm going to riot. Anyways, that's gonna be it for this almost 30-minute long video. I hope you enjoyed.